So on my left here, we've got Dr. Elizabeth Edwards, who's a research fellow at the University of Wales Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies. Excuse me. So she works on 18th century and Romantic era literature, with a focus on women's writing, travel, and the 1790s. She's also the editor of Romantic Textualities, Literature and Print Culture, special issue of Four Nations Fiction by Women from 1789 to 1830, and from the Wales and the French Revolution series. She's the author of English language poetry from Wales 1789 to 1806, and I think Liz will share a few thoughts in a moment, in particular on Price and Mary Wollstonecraft. Lovely. And then next to me here, we've got Professor Mary-Ann Constantine, and she works on Romantic era literature from and about Wales, with a focus on travel writing and the cultural politics of the 1790s. So she's published and led major research projects on Iolo Morgannwg, Wales and the French Revolution, Irish seaports, and the tours of Thomas Pennant. And she's currently completing a book at the moment on the Welsh tour, coming to the final stages. Yes. And then next to me here, you've already been introduced to Professor Iwan Morris from the University of Aberystwyth, published extensively on the history and culture of Victorian science. In more recent years, has published a biography of the Welsh natural philosopher William Robert Grove and edited Oxford Illustrated History of Science. And he's also been a co-investigator on the HRC-funded project, Unsettling Scientific Stories, Expertise, Narrative and Future Histories, and is a senior collaborator on the John Tyndall Correspondence Project at Montana State University and York University, Canada. So a very warm welcome to all of you. Looking forward to this discussion. We've got until about 2:30, I think, because Patrick needs to get a train, which will hopefully be on time. Yeah. And so if I can just turn to you, perhaps, Iwan, to begin with. You've already been out to Philadelphia and you presented there at the American Philosophical Association. I wondered if you had a couple of thoughts that you'd wish to share with us to kick off the discussion.
There are a couple of connections, I thought, between what I had to say in Philadelphia and what Patrick told us about earlier on today, that I thought might be good starting points for discussion. That notion of marginality, I think, is one of them. And the interesting ways in which, during the 18th century, at least in these circles, that, if you like, being pretentious, the ideas that produce modernity come out of the margins rather than out of the imperial centre. That it's people like Price or Franklin or Jefferson or Priestley who are very much outside the established order of things, who are kind of circling in completely different, quite different worlds around the edges of the Atlantic, and that's the context for something new and exciting. And I was struck by what he was saying about, particularly what you said, that's Jefferson and the notion of kind of the need for balance, picking up on Price, the notion that what you need in society, what you need in a proper political dispensation, is everything working properly together, everything kind of balanced out in a state of equilibrium. Which very much resonated with me. Thinking about contemporary science. Thinking about what's like Joseph Priestley, for example, has to say about the way that nature is meant to operate. That nature is meant to be in a state of balance. Priestley's wonderful phlogiston, flowing through the economy of nature and making sure that everything stays in the right place, and how that kind of notion of balance moves back and forth between nature and society in the 18th century.
Wonderful, thank you. You can maybe park your thoughts for a moment, Patrick, and respond to anything of interest in anyone's brief thoughts there. Mary-Ann, if you don't mind my turning to you, and perhaps you can share some of your thoughts and impressions on as much perhaps the age and the era as Price himself.
Thank you, yeah. I was interested in particular in the sense of the dynamic of the relationship between people and the way that news travels. And so I just wanted to read you a little piece about how news travels. Paris, July the 13th, 89, 4 o'clock in the morning. The accounts you will hear of this last night's tumults in Paris have induced me to be thus early in my assurances of our safety. The distress, the confusion, the destroying madness of the scenes I have just witnessed have actually equalled those of a town taken by storm. They have far exceeded any ideas I could have formed of insurrection in its violence and of popular rage in its extravagance. This is George Cadogan Morgan writing to his wife from the expensive, but as it turned out, fantastically well situated Grand Hôtel du Palais Royal in the Rue de Valois, the night before the storming of the Bastille. "We have not grudged the money," noted Morgan in his usual upbeat style, "as our situation at the awful moment of the revolt enabled us to see what others who lodged in a different part of town heard from us with astonishment." With his 3 other travelling companions, 2 of whom also left eyewitness accounts of a tumultuous week, Morgan was able to retreat from the ebb and flow of an excited crowd in the Palais Royal more than once in the course of that night to the comparative safety of the hotel room. And here they listened to the confusion swirling around them outside. Every now and again the report of a cannon, then the volley of a musket, carriages going past into the country, men hallooing, women screaming. In short, it was one continued scene of alarm and confusion. Not the most reassuring of letters for a family to receive, perhaps, but I suspect that none of the Morgans at home would have been wholly taken by surprise. George Cadogan, a Unitarian preacher based in Norwich, was the nephew of Richard Price. He was the son of Price's sister, Sarah. He was born in Bridgend, he was educated at Cowbridge School, and he became a pupil of Price himself at Hoxton before taking up his post in Norwich. His letters from France are vivid, engaging and intelligent, a wonderful account of a country in the very first days and weeks of the Revolution. This boiling and unsettled state of commotion, as he called it. I had the pleasure of editing them and a memoir written by Morgan's son in collaboration with Paul Frame several years ago when we were working on the Wales and the French Revolution project. And very nice to see Paul getting his just desserts in the play. Beautiful connections there. Very well done to everybody. Morgan's connection with Price is significant. As we've seen, Price had a pretty good idea of the tensions building in Paris from Jefferson, currently being modelled on our guest speaker's socks at the moment. And I think it's highly unlikely that it's accidental that George was out in France making a tour in that particular summer. Frustratingly, we know that there were 2 lost letters that Morgan wrote to his uncle from Paris, and they directly informed Price's understanding of the situation, and they too would shape the famous discourse on the love of our country delivered later that year. Those 2 letters were actually published in the Gazetteer on the 13th of August and the 14th of September 1789. Not a single copy of that Gazetteer now remains. Paul and I are pretty certain that this is not accidental. All that remains of Morgan's detailed descriptions of the scenes and the events that took place around July in the letter to his uncle, at any rate, are just a few citations in other people's works, Burke's reflections amongst them, where they're simply aired in order to be shot down as by critics who were completely hostile to their pro-French and pro-revolutionary sentiment. So the rediscovery of the letters from Morgan to his wife, which again was entirely down to Paul Frame's dogged research, is doubly precious. The interlaced, echoing accounts of 3 members of that party then give us a unique chance to experience events in Paris with a kind of multiple simultaneity. And it was particularly moving for me to be working on this sort of reportage during the uprising of the Arab Spring, particularly the events in Tahrir Square in 2011, where reporters looked down from a hotel room on a swirling commotion and tried to make sense of which side was doing what. And as I said earlier on, I find it continually amazing just how in touch people could be in difficult situations in the 18th century. And I think Price is an extremely powerful example of that. On the 2nd of August 1789, Richard Price wrote in his journal, "My nephew George has been witness underlined. Witness, at Paris, to the glorious scene. He has seen all the events that have attended the revolution in the great kingdom that now astonishes Europe, that has scarcely a parallel in the history of the world, and that is likely to be the commencement of a general reformation of the governments of Europe. Heaven grant that it may be settled without much more bloodshed. Now, I am always glad that Price did not live to see the bloodiest phase of the revolution, and I am always saddened that the intelligent, scientific, humane George Cadogan died aged 44 in 1798, leaving his large family to make an arduous journey and a new life across the Atlantic.
Lovely, thank you very much, Marianne. There's some more to reflect on there, Patrick. Over to you now, Liz. So we've had the American War of Independence, some reflections on the science shared by Priestley and Price and Franklin, and now I think we'll step forward a little bit and move towards the relationship with Mary Wollstonecraft. Is that right?
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Liz.
She was kind of circling, she's been in the room with us already today, she was circling around on one of the PowerPoints earlier on. So if you can just imagine her on that screen again. So I want to think about Price through the lens of Mary Wollstonecraft and also some of her not very well-known Welsh connections. So a little bit of background on Wollstonecraft and how she came to know Price and what Price might have meant and represented for her. So she was born in London in 1759. Her early life was quite varied. It was marked by unhappiness within her family and by a lot of moving around as a result. So her family was genteel by background, but her father was a terrible spendthrift and he was very abusive towards her mother. So you can see how this will begin to shape her views of gender and society. Always short of money as a result, this family. At the age of 16, Wollstonecraft spends a year with her family living in Larne. It was cheap, and her father, Edward Wollstonecraft, might have been hiding from some of his creditors. So it's just a year, and after that year they move back to London, and that period of her life would just be a footnote, a kind of passing moment in her life, if it wasn't for the death of her mother in 1780. So Edward Wollstonecraft quickly remarried. He remarried a housekeeper, and he's pretty much broke again at this point. He goes back to Larne, and he spends the rest of his life there until he died in 1803. So for the rest of her life, until 1797, Wollstonecraft had a kind of Welsh horizon in mind, albeit loosely and distantly. And I'll come back to that. So Wollstonecraft and Price share this slightly fragmented or uneasy family background. Wollstonecraft's is much more so, and you could say that Price was luckier overall in his circumstances, in the inheritances he had, the connections that he made. And there might be an element of gender at work here as well, because the three Wollstonecraft sisters were always much more precarious in their lives than their brothers were. So by the early to mid-1780s, as was on the slide earlier on, Wollstonecraft was running a school in Newington Green with her sisters. And it's here that she meets Price, who becomes a kind of father figure to her. And there's the beautiful depiction of Price's relationship with his wife. That couldn't have been more different from the family and the relationship modelled between her parents. He becomes a kind of father figure to her in the way that her father just could never have been. We also know that her early education was fairly patchy, so it's in these years, early 1780s, that she acquires much of the knowledge that will come to inform her later publications. So learning about the need for rational virtue in contemporary Britain, about all that luxury and corruption that we heard about earlier on. The school fails. In 1786, she takes a job as a governess in Ireland, and this is a really key period for her because she becomes a published writer. That she publishes sort of educational conduct type literature, a book for children. So far, so kind of conventional for this period in time. But you can see in her children's book, Original Stories from Real Life, that Wales has left its mark on her. So there's a long section featuring a harper, his embattled situation, the state in which his particular social circumstances have left him in. And in the second edition of 1791, Blake illustrated this book, and he illustrated the harper and the ruined castle in the background. It's a really lovely image. So Wales is still there on the horizons of her thinking and her writing. Back in London, after Ireland 1788, this is another key change for Wollstonecraft, because she begins writing for the publisher Joseph Johnson, his new periodical, The Analytical Review. And she writes over 400 reviews for this title in quite a short period of time, just a few years, often fiction, educational writing, but also political material as well. So she reviews Rousseau, the work of the freed slave Olaudah Equiano, the historian Catherine Macaulay, and crucially, Richard Price. And that work is, of course, his discourse of November 1789, which she reviewed anonymously in The Analytical the following month, so really very quickly. And I don't have time to look at that review in detail, but she said it conveys the animated sentiments of ardent virtue, a work of true and rational patriotism. And the review is in the theology section of the periodical. She quotes from it at length. She even says in the review, I've gone over my usual word count because I want to tell you so, I want to show you so much of this review in terms of quoting, of the sermon in terms of quoting for it. So long passages from the sermon. So 30 million people, the French, spurning slavery and demanding liberty, that's all there. All the most incendiary passages, if you like, of the sermon are all there. So that must have contributed in part to the circulation of the sermon as well, which was very soon after it had happened. So the Wollstonecraft of the 1780s, the kind of conventional conduct book writing Wollstonecraft, and the 1790s are very different. And the French Revolution is obviously the defining kind of cataclysmic event that takes place in between those two versions of her. But her engagement with Price is also hugely important in her development as a political writer. So Price looms large in her first Vindication of the Rights of Man of 1790, which is written in response to Burke's reflections, which of course had denounced Price. So as in that initial review of December 1789, where she defended him, and she restated the ideal of civil and religious liberty, which he and dissenting circles more generally were identified with. So like Richard Price, she believed in the ultimately transforming power of enlightened reason to bring about a new and utopian society. So Vindication of the Rights of Men was widely reviewed, and almost all the reviews comment on her temerity, her daring, as a woman in contributing to this debate, very, very masculine genre of the political pamphlet. And she'd really stepped beyond what was expected of women writers and commentators at this moment. There's another Welsh horizon for her. Her younger sister ends up working as a governess. These women are always on the move. They're looking for their next job. They're really struggling a lot of the time. Her sister, Eliza Bishop, ends up in Upton Castle near Pembroke in 1791 as a governess. She's there for a few years. And she works for a nabob, John Tasker. So she's at a distance from London, she's at a distance from the news, but she's trying to follow what's happening in France. 1791, 2, 3, 4, she's getting the newspaper. She has to read them in the middle of the night because she doesn't have much access even to the newspapers. She says, I can never get to see a paper. The whole family leave the room when I say a word about politics. The conversation turns on Murphy or Irish potatoes or Tommy Paine, whose effigy they burnt at Pembroke the other day. Nay, they talk of immortalising Miss Wollstonecraft in the like manner, but all end damning of politics. What good will they do men, they say. So we know that not everybody agreed with Wollstonecraft. Not everybody welcomed her intervention, her commentary by any means. But it was surely Richard Price who first inspired her to learn the language of rights, which was so important to her in the 1790s, back in the 1780s, and then to craft her own responses to the French Revolution. And it might be going too far, perhaps, to suggest that without Richard Price, there would be no Mary Wollstonecraft. But his role in her thinking, her writing career, and arguably even her writing style, her public presence and her reputation should be much clearer, I think, than it usually is. So I'll stop there.
Lovely. So thank you very much to the three of you for your contributions. Liz, the small history you gave us there of Mary Wollstonecraft is reminding me of last week when some of us were down in Newton Green for the raising of the plaque to Richard Price, and you might well know that in the green stands now a statue to Mary Wollstonecraft, and also opposite Richard Price's old house is where her old schoolhouse was situated, and there's a green plaque there. So when you go to that place, it's so heavy in terms of the history really weighs in a really sort of impressive way, and obviously the old chapel as well, the old meeting place. So it's wonderful to hear some more detail about Wollstonecraft, and that element I think that also came out in Patrick's talk and Iwan's talk, and the theme that you were remarking upon there, the peripherality, and in a sense what you just conveyed about Mary Wollstonecraft gives that stronger sense of how she was also on the peripheries in terms of her social status, clearly her status as a woman, but also her upbringing, and that link to Wales is really fascinating. Pat, if I can turn to you, I don't know if you have any particular comments or ideas you wanted to pick up upon, but for you as well, that theme of peripherality was something that was quite central to the talk you gave for us today. I don't know if you've got any more thoughts to expound on that theme, because it's something that's struck me since I listened to Iwan's talk over in Philadelphia, and this idea how we presume that the ideas are going to flow from the core, if you like, out to the periphery, whereas the figures that we're discussing here suggest that somehow maybe ideas don't necessarily travel in that direction, and it's often people in the less notable perhaps locations of society that contribute the sort of knowledge and ideas that really takes the society forward.
I guess, can you all hear me? Great. I guess so. One initial thought is one of the great interpretations of the coming of the American Revolution is that there's this idea that there's a fringe ideology in Great Britain called the radical Whig ideology, and it is not well accepted within Great Britain, but in the colonies, all these pamphlets are getting dumped on the colonies where they're imbibing this vision of the empire that is based on corruption and tyranny, and then they're imbibing it, and it then manifests itself during the American Revolution. And so that's another case in which ideas are flowing in very unusual directions, but are all kind of bound by this empire. The other thought that actually came to mind, two thoughts that came to mind during the comments, was what's interesting to me about Franklin, and to some extent Jefferson, is even though they were born on the periphery, and I think Price too, now that I think about it, they didn't reject the empire or the metropole immediately. In fact, in many cases, they aspired to it. I mean, Franklin, that portrait that I showed you, what interests me about that portrait is that was done in the 1760s, and if you see it, he's trying to evoke a very wealthy, elite British imperialist. And many people that have studied Franklin believe that what his real aspiration was before 1765 and the Stamp Act was to become either the royal governor appointed by the King of Pennsylvania, or the first American member of the Board of Trade that oversaw the colonies. So he was an imperialist. Jefferson, although he was born in the mountains of Virginia, was of the elite class in Virginia, most of whom's entire consumption habits were to evoke the elite, or what they thought the elite of Great Britain, how they acted, how they dressed, what they bought, how they built their houses, their country homes. So in many ways, even though they were on the peripheries, they were also trying to be a real part of that imperial core, and it's only through experience that they started to distance themselves from it. The other part about that came out in the comments is just how much of Price was he was a networker, he was a connector. I mean, I think if we knew him personally, that portrait almost doesn't do him justice, because it's clear that he was gregarious, he was outgoing, he was social, and here he looks very stern and strict, and I don't think that's who he was. And that part of him, I think, is really important to understand how he had influence on Mary Wollstonecraft, how he had influence on, with Franklin, with Priestley. It's a real element of who he was. It's the personality part that it doesn't come through in correspondence unless you kind of study the whole, which maybe leads me to my last point, which is, what I think is missing and maybe is unknowable is the extent of Franklin Price's network, because D.O. Thomas compiled Price's correspondence or what was known. And I just suspected Price was a far more, wrote far more than we know. When you compare his writing to what we know Franklin wrote or anybody of his peers, many of those papers are much larger than Price's. And so I think a lot of Price has been lost, or at least is hidden in an archive waiting to be rediscovered, because I'm sure he had a much more extensive correspondence network than we have, and that's what interests me, actually, thinking about Price in the future. So.
Yeah, let's hope they are waiting for us to discover them as opposed to...
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm thinking just when D.O. Thomas did his papers in an era in which, the internet and connectivity and information was not the same as it is today. And I just wonder if, if anybody's gone through to compare what D.O. was able to acquire, which was impressive, but what else might be out there.
Yeah.
Well, thinking about the family, I mean, for example, when I was in Philadelphia, I was emailed by a very enthusiastic woman from Georgia called Ginger, who was a descendant, if I remember rightly, of George Cadoga. So I mean, the Price network is clearly well scattered. But I mean, the point about networks and networking, I think, is absolutely spot on. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that both of us in our respective lectures kind of zeroed in on that, that sense of Price as a node through which all sorts of other people connected. So yeah, I mean, there must be lots of stuff.
On that theme, Liz, and you brought this out when you were speaking about Mary Wollstonecraft and her indebtedness to Price, in a sense. I suppose that would be a really good example of how we should think about Price, not just as this great intellectual, but also this networker, this friend of liberty who, it seems, in every opportunity that he had to help others and to encourage others, that he did so. And there's a sense in which I'm aware as somebody who's trying to push Price as hard as possible this year that we need to not descend into hagiography, as it were. And I notice sometimes that when we say these things about what Price achieved, we will sometimes talk about women's rights, for example, but it strikes me that in that particular area it might have been actually his support for Wollstonecraft more than anything that was important in terms of being an advocate, because I'm not aware in terms of his writings how much he actually wrote directly on the subject area, but you might say with his personality, his sort of kindness, his willingness to help others, that he moved the cause on, as it were, because of his willingness to support Wollstonecraft, who was, she was a real radical, wasn't she? She was somebody who was, very much before her time in terms of the way she acted and her morals and so forth.
She was, and it's a real shame her letters, they could still turn up one day, but her letters from the Newington Green period are missing. They're lost, or we don't have them. It would be amazing to see her encounters with Price, if she kind of, how did she change in that period? How did she go from someone who wrote some relatively conventional educational children's writing? How did she go from that to writing the two Vindications? And obviously the French Revolution happened in the meantime, but what happened in that decade to kind of shape her thinking and change her thinking life as she was encountering someone like Price? He said, that world is very small. If you can imagine them there in that space at that time, it must have been a small pond at that time, the Newington Green. But yeah, he supported her in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious. So when her best friend Fanny Blood was pregnant in Portugal and she had no money, it's a running theme with her. She has negative money; she's always in debt. She owes money all over the place. Some money is kind of brought to her. She comes by some money to get to passage to Lisbon to be with Fanny Blood, who dies giving birth to her child. And she suspects it was Price who paid her passage to get to Lisbon, because she was flat broke pretty much the whole time.
Yeah, that theme of debt obviously has come up more than once, and I suppose Wollstonecraft's life is very much a sort of illustration of why somebody like Price would have had such a concern with that, because it's something I've remarked previously, especially when I first came across Price. So you're thinking, gosh, here's this chap who wrote a tome on moral philosophy and wrote about politics and liberty, and then he had this sideline in insurance, and you sort of try and connect the dots, and obviously in terms of people's livelihoods and their ability to experience freedom, indebtedness was such of such huge importance. Marianne, Liz there was sort of conveying in a sense how maybe small and tight these communities were, but international as well in a sense. I mean, I think it's difficult for us now in the age of Twitter and mass communication to think of, you know, a world of letters where you didn't have communication at your fingertips as being that connected. But one of the striking things I think about this period is, you know, the sort of transatlantic community that you, Patrick, mentioned. It's something that perhaps we need to appreciate again, maybe the connectedness of this time.
Absolutely. I think the Republic of Letters, as it tends to get called rather offhandedly, is a thing. And I'm always astonished at how much actually survives in terms of packages of correspondence from all these different people. And there are these agonising gaps. Yes, there's Wollstonecraft. Yes, there's the letters that go missing to the uncle. But the more we put them together, the more you can hear people talking about each other. And there's a wonderful project running out of Oxford called Early Modern Letters Online, which is trying to suck in as much correspondence as it possibly can. And either the whole thing or summaries of the letters. And it's a massive database. And the more we feed into it, the more we can start to realise who's where at any given time, and you can start to plot them on a map, and who's actually just written to somebody about this other guy without telling him. And we can start to triangulate what people thought about each other as well as what they said to each other face to face. So I think there's just boundless possibilities at the moment for working in 18th century networks, and I think we're very lucky to have the potential to use digital technologies to bring those voices back into play. So definitely something I'm interested in following up.
And you might be possibly not the most, how can I put it, neutral person in responding to this question, but when we're talking about the second half of the 18th century, you know, we're talking about a era and a time that was just definitive, it would be fair to say, in terms of moulding the modern world. Is that right? You know, so when we're talking about the insignificance of Price and Wollstonecraft and these other figures, it's not simply the breadth of their accomplishments, perhaps, but it's also the way in which their legacy really does live on, as it were, and has shaped us. And you know, for example, in the world of morals, ideas of sort of political philosophy, you know, I very much say that those are the sort of formative ideas that we still hold on to today in many ways.
Definitely. I think the 10 years between 1789 to 1800, so much happens in that time. So much that would not have been thinkable becomes thinkable. It's an astonishing decade to work on. And I have to say that education is incredibly important in this decade. And one thing you come across again and again is the respect people have across the board for reading and learning. And actually part of what happens in the late 18th century is an explosion in printed literature which is suddenly accessible to people with very little money. And you start to get these brilliant minds, people like Tom Paine, who have not been formally educated, not gone through the universities, not even been through kind of dissenting panels, suddenly finding their voices and being able to write beautifully about these new ideas. So it was really interesting to hear you talking about common sense earlier on, and I love the idea of Price as a kind of thinking man's Paine. That's just lovely. But education and respect for learning. If only that could be conveyed to schools now. I mean, that's the thing that we want to get across, isn't it?
It reminds me of sorry, Patrick, please.
I just wanted to follow, because that's something I've noticed and talked about myself in the American context, which is the American Philosophical Society in this period started to issue prizes, to do awards, to try to get citizens to respond to calls. And one of their questions was, how should you educate people in a democracy? And what they said is public education is essential because it's an educated citizenry that's a bulwark against the fears that Price saw happening. And in the United States, there's a growth in public schools, both in the K to 12 that didn't exist in, but especially in the universities. I mean, this is the founding of the first state-supported universities. There were maybe less than a dozen colleges before the Ivy League, essentially. But all of a sudden, there are small colleges sprouting up in the back country. In the 1790s, Williams College, way western Massachusetts, Franklin and Marshall, all these colleges are sprouting up precisely because they're trying to educate their citizens for a democracy. And without education, they thought it would just become a tyranny and anarchy, the mob rule. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting how in the discourse on the love of our country, Price holds forth on the great benefits and virtues of humanity, and one of the three key concepts he has is truth, and that then is tied to knowledge. And it's really interesting to put that in the context that you're speaking about, where you have the printing press now becoming something that's churning out huge numbers of pamphlets, and that you have this increasingly informed electorate. And it's something that Price puts a great emphasis on, this idea that you can't have virtuous citizens, you can't have good governance unless people are given the knowledge to be able to navigate as it were political society. And I think obviously that's a very timely sort of reminder for us as well, isn't it, in the age of mass media and fake news and so forth.
Yeah, I was struck particularly by some of the quotes that you had in your lecture, and the way that those resonated with the sorts of language of political radicals in the 1820s, 1830s. Things around the founding of Mechanics' Institute, the education of free people. That notion that that freedom and a new kind of politics can only operate if the people are educated, and if the education is in their own hands. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff there. You need to provide your own education, otherwise it's just you're just like a hunting dog. You'll just be doing as you're told, as opposed to doing what's in your own best interests.
Well, that was this is, many people call this some people see this as an age of libertarianism, and Price, I think, read simply, could seem like a radical libertarian, just let people be free and have liberty and do whatever they want. But one of the things he talks about is moral liberty, which is what is the guidepost for you to pursue virtue in the public good. And it's education that provides you with that ability to figure out what the right things are to do. So, Price is not a libertine, libertarian perhaps in that context, but definitely not a libertine at all. And he was castigated as being that, and he wasn't.
Indeed. So we've got about 10 minutes or so left. So if you want to ask a question or two, you're quick on the draw there. I've got your mark there. Before turning to the audience, I just wanted to give the panel one more opportunity to reflect on the question that Professor John Tucker put to Patrick so directly at the end of the last session. And one of the sort of questions that I suppose is an impetus behind these Price 300 and our activities this year, which is why perhaps Price has been forgotten. And Liz, if I can turn to you first, I've sort of surmised that there's a difference between Wollstonecraft and Price, partly because Wollstonecraft, in a sense, was recovered by the feminist movement. They both sort of suffered in terms of their legacy immediately after their death. Is that perhaps a definitive factor, you think, that the feminist movement took up Wollstonecraft as a heroine, as it were, or are there other things going on in terms of the legacy of the two, and why perhaps Wollstonecraft is so much more recognised figure?
Yeah, I mean, Wollstonecraft has been recovered. Obviously, she's become this, the mother of feminism is the sort of title that sticks with her. I mean, after her death, the way that Godwin represented her after her death, her reputation, such as it was before she died, was absolutely trashed. So, she's maybe never been forgotten in the same way, right, because she wasn't just famous, she was infamous. She was famous for a time. She was properly famous in the 1790s, where you could talk about burning her in effigy in Pembroke. I mean, maybe that's because her sister's kind of on the scene, but, again, you could replicate that in other places as well. So she's always controversial, she becomes infamous, and then obviously she's taken up in the 20th century, and she's thoroughly rehabilitated in the way that we would look at her now. I think you can see Price, if you look carefully, you can see Price obviously living on in her work at the very turn of the 1790s. I'm curious what would have happened had he not died in spring 1791. Okay, so he was spared seeing the scenes that came afterwards, but just to be counterfactual for a moment, what if he hadn't? What would he have done? He's fallen away, I think, because he dies at the right moment or the wrong moment. I'm not sure which it is, for him. But if he'd lived on, if he'd been the one maybe responding to, Burke sold 30,000 copies of the Reflections. So he had to reply to, Payne felt he had to reply. Wollstonecraft got in there first, she had to reply. Would Price have replied? What kind of figure would he have been for the 1790s if he had had the right of reply in his own voice? I mean, we can't know. Would he have become one of those kind of lost radicals in the repressive culture of the 1790s? Perhaps he would have. But again, new historicism would have recovered him at some point in the meantime. So, yeah, he died at the wrong moment or the right moment. I'm not sure which one it is, but I would love to think about him as a voice who might have, endured through the decade and perhaps had a very, very different kind of afterlife and reception history.
Thanks, it's really interesting. And Iwan, very briefly, that theme of peripherality, I wonder sometimes if his Welshness is a factor at all in the fact that he perhaps hasn't been remembered as he might have been, and that might be partly to do with who we remember and lionise as Welsh people as well. We have an awful lot to say about our poets, perhaps in the modern era, our sports stars, not perhaps so much scientists and philosophers.
Not so much our natural philosophers, not so much our philosophers and political thinkers. Yes, I mean, I'm sure that Welshness and the peripherality and the ease of dismissal of Welshness is part of it. And not unrelated to that, and given that I'm a Victorianist, I'm going to blame the Victorians for the forgetting of people like Price. Because it's clear that the spectre of the French Revolution casts a very, very long shadow over much of the 19th century. I mean, you can see some of my natural philosophers desperately trying to distance themselves from the way in which science at the end of the 18th century was all entangled up with radical politics. So you're kind of trying to produce very, very sanitized versions of people who are up to their necks radicals during the actual revolutionary period. I mean, Price got lost, I think, in that effort at sort of cleaning up after the terror.
Interesting, thank you. And Mary-Ann, any concluding thoughts for us on that theme or anything else you'd like to comment on before we open the floor?
Just to say that in an era of the soundbite and extreme opinions on everything, Price's voice always sounds so calm, so clear, so rational, and that we need to start thinking in sentences again.
A nice concluding thought, Patrick.
Price knew how to have a friendly disagreement with people, which is something else I think that's lost. And the last thing I'll say, as I mentioned to somebody in the lunch break, is I understand there is no statue to Richard Price in Great Britain, and it seems like that would be something that should happen. So. Yeah.
There's quite a lot of space outside this building, actually, isn't there? So, yeah. Roger, you had a question.
I was fascinated by what you were saying, what you've been talking about is communication and the time lag between the letters. And what about them going missing, as we know a number of them were, and we know that a lot of his correspondence was intercepted at some time. It seems very haphazard that things have happened and gone ahead in that kind of... How long did a letter take to get from Paris to London or over the sea to New York? How long did it take? We haven't got this modern internet, and it's there, it's instant, you look it up and you email someone. It just doesn't exist today.
Absolutely fascinating.
It just blows my mind.
What you get is a kind of time lag in what's actually happening to the person in the other country and what the other person thinks is happening. And there was a moment earlier on, wasn't there, where two letters arrived at once, I think in your lecture. So he gets the pre-story and then the actual story in the same package. But it's astonishing how they get through. It really is.
6 weeks across the Atlantic, we estimate. In fact, what's fascinating with the coming of the American Revolution is to think about how that would factor into reaction and action. So, in Boston, say in the Stamp Act, they tear down the governor's mansion in protest. It takes 6 weeks for London to find out. They get upset, they react, they send some reaction back. It's now been 4 months since that's happened. It's kind of blown over. And then they're like poking the bear again, So the communication is a real factor in terms of politics in this moment, escalating things inadvertently. So.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more question. There's a hand in the back there.
Just one remark about the impact of the French Revolution. When I was listening to this discussion, which was fascinating, one of the contributions from everybody, is that the Chinese leader Zhou Enlai was asked by Henry Kissinger, its own encounter, about the impact of the French Revolution on world society, on China, and his answer was too smooth to tell.
Still is.
Lovely. Well, I think that concludes the discussion. Oh, well, I think we can allow one question to this gentleman. Actually, before you stand up, just a word. Many people have already referenced Paul today, and I think we all owe him an immense thank you, really, for the work that he did in pulling together a wonderful biography, Liberty's Apostle. Buy it if you haven't done already. And, Vic mentioned this as well in terms of the play, how indebted we are. So it's really lovely to be able to say thank you to you, Paul, for your work. In the same breath, I'd like to also say a posthumous thank you in one sense as well to Dio Thomas, who Patrick has just mentioned. Dio Thomas was in the philosophy department in Aberystwyth and did immense amount of work around Richard Price as a philosopher. Was one of those really who reinstated Richard Price in the history of moral philosophy in a sense, and also did an awful lot of work in collecting his writings. So that's somebody else I think that we will need to mention in dispatches as the year progresses. Sorry, Paul, I just wanted to say that before allowing you to pose a question.
Many thanks to everybody here, and Patrick, and to everyone for their lectures. And I hope you take part of those 3 events, or 4 events we've had so far.
Thank you.
When I was sitting in my desk writing 6 rewrites of Price's moral philosophy, I never thought it would end up with all this, so it's absolutely fantastic.